Hello again, Planeswalkers. This is Eric from Bane Alley Magic bringing you another Deck Tech video, and today we're talking about the Theros Beyond Death spoiler, Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. So Uro is 1, a green and a blue for a 6/6 legendary Elder Giant. When Uro enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless it escaped. Whenever Uro enters the battlefield or attacks, you gain 3 life and draw a card. Then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield, and it escapes for 2 green and 2 blue, and by exiling 5 other cards from your graveyard. So, when I first saw this card, I knew it would be an auto include in almost any Simic deck. If you just take away the creature and treat this like a sorcery spell that just gains you 3 life and draws you a card and lets you play an extra land, that's still a great deal for 3 mana. But on top of that, we also get a 6/6 Elder Giant creature. Very cool creature type, by the way. And much like the other Titans, this triggers also when Uro attacks. So we can repeatedly be gaining life and drawing cards. So Uro does things we want commanders to do. He ramps, draws us cards, and he's big, so he's a survivor and a threat for our opponents. The escape mechanic requires that we have our graveyard nicely packed with cards, so I've included 19 spells that put cards into the graveyard and 10 lands that either sacrifice themselves or other lands for value, giving us a total of 29 ways to fill the graveyard. That being said, this deck is not necessarily graveyard themed, though it probably could be built that way. The main idea of this deck is to cast tons of creatures, play lots of lands, draw tons of cards, and eventually overrun our opponent. So we have 2 win conditions. The first is just combat damage, right? We have a ton of creatures, we just overrun our opponents with combat damage. We are a Simic Stompy deck. The second win condition is an infinite combo that also allows us to win through combat damage. So here's some more numbers about the deck. We have 42 creatures, 14 ramp spells, 22 draw card spells, 10 removal spells, 6 counter spells, and 34 lands. So we have a lot of creatures, and a lot of these other effects are on the creatures themselves. We got creatures that ramp, creatures that draws cards, creatures that act like removal, and almost actually all of our counter spells are all on creatures. We only have 34 lands because we have so much ramp in the deck that we have room for more lands. So we got a lot of ramp because we got a few hefty monsters, and also we just want to be able to cast as many spells as possible, sort of storming off, just drawing tons of cards and casting a lot of creatures. So let's get into the deck, starting with the creatures. So the first is Dakra Mystic, 1 blue for a 1/1 Merfolk Wizard, and you can pay a blue and tap it to have each player reveal the top card of their library. You may put the revealed cards into their owner's graveyards. If you don't, each player draws a card. So this is a really fun card. You get to look at everyone's top card of their library and kind of make this political decision of, do you want everyone to draw a card or do you want everyone to mill the card? And it's perfect in our deck because we want to mill cards so we can escape Uro. Next we have Hapless Researcher, 1 blue for a 1/1 wizard. You can sacrifice Hapless Researcher to draw a card, then discard a card from your hand. So Hapless Researcher just helps us fill our graveyard by putting himself in the graveyard and also another card that we discard from our hand. And it draws a card, so not a bad deal in this deck. Next we have Llanowar Elves, 1 green for a 1/1 elf druid that taps for a green. Just great ramp. Elfish Mystic is the exact same thing. 1 green for a 1/1 elf druid that taps for a green. Birds of Paradise is a 0/1 bird with flying that you can tap to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So we got all the little mana dorks. Next we have Crashing Drawbridge, 2 mana for a 0/4 wall with Defender that you can tap to give your creatures haste until the end of the turn. This is a really awesome card from Throne of Eldraine, and I'm really glad they printed it, just giving any deck the ability to give their creatures haste. Of course, Crashing Drawbridge doesn't have haste, so you have to, plan around that. It enters with Summoning Sickness, and it can't give your creatures haste until your next turn. But I think it's pretty sweet for green decks and blue decks to have the ability to give all their creatures haste. Next, we have Daring Saboteur, 1 and a blue for a 2/1 human pirate. And for 2 and a blue, it can't be blocked. And whenever Daring Saboteur deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. And more card draw and filling the graveyard. Next is Thrasios, Triton Hero, a green and a blue for a 1/3 Merfolk Wizard, and you can pay 4 to scry 1, then reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, otherwise draw a card. This is another fabulous Simic commander, just drawing you cards and ramping, and this is also part of our combo, which we'll go over later. So moving along, we have Jace's Archivist, 1 and 2 blue for a 2/2 Vidalcan Wizard. You can pay a blue and tap it, and each player discards his or her hand, then draws cards equal to the greatest number of cards a player discarded this way. So we are kind of windfalling, I think, is the term for this. Everyone discards their hand, then draws cards equal to the greatest number of cards a player discarded this way. So, filling our graveyard and drawing us more cards again. Same with Bazaar Trade Mage, 2 and a blue for a 3/4 human wizard with flying. When Bazaar Trade Mage enters the battlefield, draw 2 cards, then discard 3 cards. Next we have Farhaven Elf, 2 and a green for a 1/1 Elf Druid. When Farhaven Elf enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, then put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. Wood Elves is 2 and a green for a 1/1 Elf Scout. When Wood Elves enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a forest card and put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So Wood Elves, I'd say, is a little bit better because it gets you, any forest. So we do have one forest that's also a forest island that Wood Elves can tutor, and Wood Elves doesn't say it enters the battlefield tapped. Next we have Courser of Krufix, 1 and 2 green for a 2/4 Centaur. Play with the top card of your library revealed. You may play the top card of your library if it's a land card. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. So Courser of Krufix isn't necessarily what we'd call ramp, because it's not giving you an extra land per turn, but it is giving you an extra ability to get a land per turn, right? Whenever you're able to cast the top or play the top card of your library, you're basically having an extra card in your hand at all times, which is pretty awesome. So Courser is, for the most part, card advantage, right? If it's a land, you get to draw it and play it. That's what gets you the card advantage, right? Keep playing the land off the top of your library, so it saves you the lands in your hands and keeps digging you through your library for the next card. Next we have Nimble Obstructionist, 2 and a blue for a 3/1 bird wizard with flash and flying, and cycling for 2 and a blue. So for 2 and a blue, you can discard it from your hand and draw a card. And when you cycle Nimble Obstructionist, counter target activated or triggered ability you don't control. So this is our first counter spell on a creature, right? Can counter some nasty activated or triggered abilities. Next we have Selhoff Occultist, 2 and a blue for a 2/3 human rogue. Whenever Selhoff Occultist or another creature dies, target player puts the top card of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So whenever Uro sacrifices himself, or whenever any creature dies, Selhoff Occultist is going to help fill our graveyard. Next we have Eternal Witness, 1 and 2 green for a 2/1 human shaman. When Eternal Witness enters the battlefield, you may return target card from your graveyard to your hand. So essential in any green deck, but especially one that fills the graveyard. Next we have Thassa, God of the Sea, 2 and a blue for a 5/5 legendary enchantment creature god, which is indestructible. It's not a creature unless your devotion to blue is 5 or more, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you scry 1, and you can pay 1 and a blue, and target creature you control can't be blocked this turn. So this is help filtering our draws, dig through our deck, find the cards that we actually want, and make our creatures unblockable as well. And if she can become a creature, yeah, she's a 5/5 beater. Not a bad deal. Next, we have Champion of Wits, 2 and a blue for a 2/1 Naga Wizard. When Champion of Wits enters the battlefield, you may draw cards equal to its power. If you do, discard 2 cards, and you can eternalize it for 7. So for 5 and 2 blue, you exile it from your graveyard and create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 4/4 black zombie. So when you eternalize it, you draw 4 and discard 2. So again, just drawing us cards and helping us fill our graveyard. Next is Daring Apprentice, 1 and 2 blue for a 1/1 wizard, and you can tap and sacrifice Daring Apprentice to counter any target spell. So this is in the deck because we want lots of creatures, and this is a counter spell that's on a creature. Next we have Vizier of the Menagerie, 3 and a green for a 3/4 Naga Cleric. You may look at the top card of your library, you may cast the top card of your library if it's a creature card, and you may spend mana as though it were any type to cast creature spells. So this is another reason we have a lot of creatures in the deck, because we have Vizier of the Menagerie, and we can kind of just, with Vizier of the Menagerie and Courser of Crufix, we can kind of just go off and, just play multiple cards off of the top of our deck. Next we have Eryxmathes, Slumbering Isle, 2, a green and a blue for a 12/12 Kraken. Eryxmathes, Slumbering Isle, enters the battlefield tapped with 5 slumber counters on it. As long as Eryxmathes has a slumber counter on it, it's a land, it's not a creature. Whenever you cast a spell, you may remove a slumber counter from Eryxmathes, and Eryxmathes taps for a green and a blue. So, another fabulous Simic Commander option, a 12/12 Kraken for just 4 mana. Of course, there are some stipulations, right? You have to cast 4 more spells in order for it to actually be a creature, but in the meantime, it's helping you ramp. And this is also something that can help us in our combo. Next is Glen Elendra Archmage, 3 and a blue for a 2/2 fairy wizard with flying. You can pay a blue and sacrifice Glen Elendra Archmage to counter target non-creature spell, and it has persist. So when this creature dies, if it had no +1/+1 counters on it, you return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter on it. So you get to use her twice, basically, to counter 2 non-creature spells. So this is another counter spell on a creature. Next we have Cephalid Broker, 3 and a blue for a 2/2 Cephalid, and you can tap Cephalid Broker, and target player draws 2 cards, then discards 2 cards. Next we have Frilled Mystic, 2 green and 2 blue for a 3/2 Elf Lizard Wizard with Flash. When Frilled Mystic enters the battlefield, you may counter target spell. Next we have Venser, Shaper Savant, 2 and 2 blue for a 2/2 human wizard with flash. When Venser, Shaper Savant enters the battlefield, return target spell or permanent to its owner's hand. So this is effectively countering the spell for 1 turn, right? Returning it to their hand. And this gets around spells that can't be countered because you're not technically countering them. You're returning them to their owner's hand. Or you can choose to return a permanent to its owner's hand instead. Next we have Mystic Snake, 1 a green and 2 blue for a 2/2 snake with flash. When Mystic Snake enters the battlefield, counter target spell. Next we have Lay Weaver, 3 and a green for a 2/2 human druid, and it partners with Lore Weaver, but we don't have Lore Weaver in the deck, so don't worry about that. Lore Weaver draws you cards. Anyway, with Lay Weaver, we can tap it to untap 2 target lands, and that is also part of our combo. Moving along, we have Oracle of Moldiah, 3 and a green for a 2/2 Elf Shaman. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. Play with the top card of your library revealed. You may play the top card of your library if it's a land card. So Oracle of Moldiah, unlike Courser of Crufix, is both ramp and card advantage in 1 card, and that's why it's such an expensive card, because you're getting card advantage by being able to play the top card of your library, so it's as though you have an extra card in your hand, and it lets you play an extra land on each of your turns. Really sweet card in any green deck. Next we have Prime Speaker Vannifar, 2 a green and a blue for a 2/4 Elf Ooze Wizard. You can tap it and sacrifice another creature to search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost equal to 1 plus the sacrificed creature's converted mana cost. Put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Activate this ability only any time you could cast a sorcery. So with Prime Speaker Vanifar, this just helps us tutor for whatever creature we need in the deck. We do have a pretty even curve as far as mana costs go. And yeah, every turn she can just get something else if we want to keep sacrificing something. So she helps us fill up our graveyard as well. Next we have Genesis, 4 and a green for a 4/4 incarnation. As at the beginning of your upkeep, if Genesis is in your graveyard, you may pay 2 and a green. If you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So this is just a repeatable way to keep getting creatures from our graveyard back to our hand. Next we have Magus of the Future. 2 and 3 blue for a 2/3 human wizard that says you play with the top card of your library revealed, and you may play the top card of your library. So you might see a pattern here. We got lots of creatures that let us do this, but with Magus of the Future, it lets us play literally any card from the top of our library, whether it be a land or creature or a non-creature spell. Murder of Crows is 3 and 2 blue for a 4/4 bird with flying. Whenever another creature dies, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So, again, Uro sacrifices himself, so there is lots of dying going on with this deck consistently. And also, other creatures die throughout the game all the time. So yeah, this is a nice little source of card advantage, drawing us cards and filling our graveyard. Next we have Krufix, God of Horizons. 3, a green, and a blue for a 4/7 legendary enchantment creature god with indestructible. As long as your devotion to green and blue is less than 7, Krufix isn't a creature. You have no maximum hand size, and if unused mana would empty from your mana pool, that mana becomes colorless instead. This is another fabulous option for your Simic commander. It gives you no maximum hand size, which is really useful when you're drawing a lot of cards, like with this deck. And the ability to store our mana and use it on future turns is just fabulous, especially with Seedborn Muse, which we'll get to in a second. But yeah, with Krufix, you just store up a ton of mana. It makes it so you can almost cast every spell in your hand. Really great card. Next we have Magus of the Jar, 3 and 2 blue for a 3/3 human wizard. You can tap and sacrifice Magus of the Jar to have each player remove his or her hand from the game face down, and then draw 7 cards. At the end of the turn, each player discards his or her hand and returns to his or her hand each card he or she removed from the game this way. So for one turn, everyone gets a brand new hand, and then at the end of the turn, that brand new hand gets discarded, and then you get your old hand back. And so, again, just card advantage and filling the graveyard. Next is Seedborn Muse, 3 and 2 green for a 2/4 spirit that says untap all permanents you control during each other player's untap step. So this makes it so we always have mana available, and it really goes well with Krufix. Just at the end of every single turn, we tap all of our mana to store that mana to use for later with Krufix. But yeah, even without Krufix, this is just a fabulous card. It lets you counter spells on top of casting spells on your own turn. Great card in any green deck. Next we have Pathbreaker Ibex, 4 and 2 green for a 3/3 goat. Whenever Pathbreaker Ibex attacks, creatures you control gain trample and get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So this is like a miniature Craterhoof Behemoth, just giving all of our creatures big power boost, and trample is a great way to end games. Next we have Prime Speaker Zagana, 2 green and 2 blue for a 1/1 Merfolk Wizard. Prime Speaker Zagana enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. When Prime Speaker Zagana enters the battlefield, draw cards equal to its power. Alright, so let's say you had all of these creatures on the battlefield and then you cast Prime Speaker Zagana. So since Uro has power of 6, Prime Speaker Zagana would enter with 6 +1/+1 counters, giving her a total power of 7, and with her second ability she would draw you 7 cards. So she could be potentially a huge creature and draw you a ton of cards, just what we want. Yet another great Simic Commander option. Next we have Avenger of Zendikar. 5 and 2 green for a 5/5 elemental. When Avenger of Zendikar enters the battlefield, create a 0/1 plant creature token for each land you control. And whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature you control. So Avenger of Zendikar is just a miniature army in a can. It can end games all by itself. Next we have Scourge of Fleets, 5 and 2 blue for a 6/6 Kraken. When Scourge of Fleets enters the battlefield, return each creature your opponents control with toughness X or less to its owner's hand, where X is the number of islands you control. So yeah, this could potentially be just a one-sided board wipe. Awesome card. Next we have Nezahal, Primal Tide, 5 and 2 blue for a 7/7 legendary Elder Dinosaur. Nezahal Primal Tide can't be countered. You have no maximum hand size. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, draw a card, and you can discard 3 cards and exile Nezahal. Return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So, Nezahal, it draws us cards. It allows us to discard cards, it gives us no maximum hand size, and it's a huge body that can't be countered. This is just a fabulous card. I love Nezahal. I put it in almost every blue deck, actually. It draws you a lot of cards with that third ability, right? Your opponents just cast a non-creature spell, and no matter what, you're drawing a card. But yeah, what's really great in this deck, too, is that you can discard 3 cards to protect Nezahal, right? And that fills up our graveyard. And our last 2 creatures are Hornet Queen and Craterhoof Behemoth. So Hornet Queen is 4 and 3 green for a 2/2 insect with flying and death touch. When Hornet Queen enters the battlefield, put 4 1/1 green insect creature tokens with flying and death touch on the battlefield. So this is another sort of mini army in a can. I love having Hornet Queen because she just gives us the best blockers, right? Flying and death touch. Our opponents have a really hard time attacking us after we cast a Hornet Queen. This is 5 bodies in 1 card. Pretty sweet. Next we have Craterhoof Behemoth, 5 and 3 green for a 5/5 beast with haste. When Craterhoof Behemoth enters the battlefield, creatures you control gain trample and get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. So Craterhoof Behemoth just ends games all the time. Again, we have 42 creatures in the deck. So let's say we just had 5 creatures on the deck. Let's say we just cast Hornet Queen, and we have only Hornet Queen and the 4 insect creature tokens that she created. Then we cast Craterhoof Behemoth. So that gives us a total of 6 creatures on the battlefield. And that means all of our creatures are going to get +6/+6 and trample. So that's a total of 47 power right there. Definitely enough to kill 1 or 2 opponents. But if we have more creatures, that gets to be even more. You know, if you have 10 creatures on the battlefield, they're all getting +10/+10. So this is one of the win conditions of the deck. We eventually draw a Craterhoof Behemoth and play it on a board full of creatures and just kill all of our opponents at the same time with hundreds of points of damage, potentially. So those were the creatures, and here is the infinite combo that involves the creatures. So we already mentioned Leyweaver, Arixmethes, and Thrasios. The infinite combo happens with the card Freed from the Real, 2 and a blue for an enchantment aura. You can pay a blue to tap or untap the enchanted creature. So the combo happens when we have either Arixmethes or Leyweaver on the battlefield, or both of them, or Simic Growth Chamber and Thrasios. So let's say we have Arixmethes on the battlefield, he's a creature, and we enchant Arixmethes with Freed from the Real. We tap Arixmethes to add a green and blue mana to our mana pool. Then we use the blue mana to activate Freed from the Real and untap Arixmethes, and then we can tap him again to add another green and another blue mana to our mana pool. And each time we're doing this, we're netting 1 green mana. So with that, we can make infinite green mana. With Leyweaver, we can enchant Leyweaver with Freed from the Real, and then Leyweaver can tap to untap 2 target lands. So let's say she untapped a forest and an island. You tap that forest and island and make another blue and a green mana, and you use the blue mana to activate Freed from the Real and untap Leyweaver. And then you tap Leyweaver to untap that forest and blue mana again, and in that again you're making an infinite amount of green mana. And if you have lands that make, if both of the lands make both green and blue, or if one of the lands is like Simic Growth Chamber where it makes 2 mana by itself, you're making an infinite amount of mana of any color combination there with Ley Weaver for any combination of green and blue. So anyway, once you have infinite mana, then you can dump that infinite mana into Thrasios, where it says you can pay 4 to scry 1 and reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you put it onto the battlefield tapped, otherwise you draw a card. So with Thrasios and infinite mana, you can pretty much just draw your entire deck and put every land onto the battlefield, and you have infinite mana still, so you can cast every single card from your hand at that point. And you have all your counter spells in your hand also, so your opponents can't really do much about it. And even if your opponents respond by trying to kill Thrasios, you can respond to that by spending the mana again to activate Thrasios and continue drawing cards. So that is the infinite combo. We draw all of our cards, we play all of our creatures, and then eventually we play Craterhoof Behemoth and just kill all of our opponents at once. Moving along to our non-creature spells, we have Careful Study, 1 blue for a sorcery, draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards. Breakthrough is X and a blue for a sorcery, draw 4 cards, then choose X cards in your hand and discard the rest. This is a really interesting card, but it works great with this deck where we want to keep the graveyard filled, right? So we're going to draw 4 cards, and we choose X cards that we want to keep out of our hand, and we're going to choose to, just discard all the rest of the cards. That is pretty sweet. I mean, it's a great way to get a bunch of cards in our graveyard and still have some cards left over. Next, we have Ideas Unbound. 2 blue for a sorcery arcane. Draw 3 cards. Discard 3 cards at the end of the turn. And by the way, if at the end of the turn you have no more cards in your hand, then, well, it doesn't matter. You just drew 3 cards for 2 blue mana. Pretty sweet card. Next, we have Monastery Siege. 2 and a blue for an enchantment. As Monastery Siege enters the battlefield, choose Khans or Dragons. If you chose Khans, at the beginning of your draw step, you draw an additional card, then discard a card. If you chose Dragons, spells your opponents cast that target you or a permanent you control cost 2 more to cast. So if we don't already have a ton of ways of drawing cards and discarding cards, we can choose Khans. But if we do already have many ways of drawing cards, then we might want to choose Dragons to protect our stuff, make it harder for our opponents to target our permanents. Next, we have Guardian Project. 3 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, draw a card. So in Commander, that always means every time you cast a creature, you're going to draw a card. Pretty sweet in any creature-themed deck. Next, we have Greater Good. 2 and 2 green for an enchantment. Sacrifice a creature, draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, and then discard 3 cards. So, more card draw and more discard on an enchantment that also is a sack outlet. I put sack outlets in almost every deck because being able to sacrifice creatures is often much more preferable to what your opponents want to do. Your opponents want to make copies of your creatures. If they want to exile your creature, if they want to gain control of your creature, you can always respond by sacrificing your creature instead. Next, we have Praetor's Council. 5 and 3 green for a sorcery. Return all cards from your graveyard to your hand. Exile Praetor's Council. You have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. Yeah, this card is excellent in any green deck, but especially one that cares so much about the graveyard, right? So we get all the cards from our graveyard back to our hand, and we have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. And that being said, there is at least 4 ways in this deck that give us no maximum hand size, so that's pretty sweet. Next, we have Kodama's Reach. 2 and a green for a sorcery arcane. Search your library for up to 2 basic land cards. Reveal those cards and put 1 onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand. Then shuffle your library. So, if you haven't already played your land for turn, you can put the card that you put into your hand with Kodama's Reach onto the battlefield also. So this could be getting you 2 lands onto the battlefield, right, if you haven't already played a land for turn. We are, of course, running Soul Ring. Next is Cultivate, 2 and a green for the exact same thing as Kodama's Reach. Heroic Intervention. is a way to protect our creatures. It's an instant. Permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until the end of the turn. Next we have Lifeline. 5 mana for an artifact that says whenever a creature is put into a graveyard and a creature is in play, return that creature from your graveyard to play at the end of the turn. So I'm pretty sure this works for all players as well, so it's for everyone whenever their creature dies. As long as another creature is still on the battlefield, the creature that died comes back onto the battlefield at the end of the turn. What's great with this deck is that Uro sacrifices himself if it didn't escape, right? Uro is going to sacrifice himself, and then Lifeline is going to bring him back at the end of the turn when she's going to sacrifice himself again and draw us another card and gain us 3 more life and let us put another land from our hand onto the battlefield. And what Lifeline has been updated to say is it returned to the play at the beginning of the next end step. So that means at the next player's end step, Uro's going to come back, sacrifice itself, draw us cards and everything again, and then that's going to happen basically every single turn until we can escape with Uro, right? But so Lifeline is fabulous in this deck. Next we have Panharmonicon. 4 mana for an artifact. If an artifact or creature entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Yes, every enter the battlefield effect is doubled with Panharmonicon, and we do actually have a ton of enter the battlefield triggers in this deck. Next we have Freed from the Real, which we already discussed. Next is our removal package, starting with Rapid Hybridization. 1 blue for an instant, destroy target creature, it can't be regenerated. That creature's controller puts a 3/3 frog lizard creature token onto the battlefield. So, always a pretty good deal, get rid of their best creature and turn it into a 3/3. Same with Beast Within. 2 and a green for an instant, destroy target permanent, its controller creates a 3/3 beast creature token. Get rid of any permanent you want, replace it with a 3/3. Next is Imprisoned in the Moon. 2 and a blue for an enchantment aura. Enchant a creature, land, or planeswalker and transform it into a colorless land. So, great deal. Just especially good against commanders, right? If you enchant your opponent's commander with this, it is really hard for them to get their commander back because it just becomes a land. Unless they can destroy this enchantment or destroy target land, their commander just stays on the battlefield and just doesn't do anything for the rest of the game. Same with Song of the Dryad. 2 and a green for an aura, enchant permanent, so any permanent becomes a colorless forest land. Next is Cyclonic Rift. 1 and a blue for an instant, return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand, or you can overload it for 7, so for 6 and a blue, you return each non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. And being at instant speed is why this is one of the best cards in the game, because it is just one of the most explosive responses to anything. Like, you can wait till your opponent's end step and cast this, and they return all their non-land permanents to their hand, and then they have to discard down to 7. Or you can wait until your opponent has spent a ton of resources on this one plan of theirs, and then you cast this, and their whole plan fizzles, and all those resources go away, right? And it is just fabulous, right? They attack you with 100 creatures, and they think they're going to win the game, and no, you cast Cyclonic Rift, return all their non-land permanents to their hand, and it's kind of like they're back to square one. You know, they have to recast everything all over again. Really great card. Next we have Aetherize. 3 and a blue for an instant, return all attacking creatures to their owner's hand. So sort of a one-sided board wipe for and a single opponent who's attacking you. Next we have Devastation Tide. 3 and 2 blue for a sorcery. Return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands, and you can miracle this for 1 and a blue. So you may cast this card for its miracle cost when you draw it, if it's the first card you drew this turn. So what that means is you kind of have to, as soon as you draw it, before you even put it into your hand, you're supposed to reveal it right away and say, oh, this is the first card I drew this turn, so I'm going to cast it right away for its miracle cost. You can't wait till farther on in the turn to cast it either. You have to cast it right away. Next, we have Crush of Tentacles, 4 and 2 blue for a sorcery. It has Surge for 5, so for 3 and 2 blue, you may cast this spell for its Surge cost if you or a teammate has cast another spell this turn. And it says return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands. If Crush of Tentacles' Surge cost was paid, put an 8/8 blue octopus creature token onto the battlefield. So this is potentially, the ceiling of this is just paying 5 mana to get an 8/8 creature and return all other non-land permanents to their owner's hands. So it just leaves you so far ahead for just 5 mana. I think this is a really great card. I would try it out in any blue deck if you haven't tried it out yet. I think it's a good deal. Next we have River's Rebuke, 4 and 2 blue for a sorcery. It says return all non-land permanents target player controls to their owner's hand. So just one single player gets all their non-land permanents back to their hand. And that brings us to the lands, of which we have only 34 lands because, like I said, we have so much ramp. So we have Bant Panorama, which taps to add a colorless mana to our mana pool, or we can pay 1 and tap it and sacrifice it to search our library for a forest, plains, or island and put it onto the battlefield tapped. The reason this is in the deck is because I said I wanted a lot of lands that sacrifice themselves so we could keep filling our graveyard with stuff that we can help Uro escape with. Next is Simic Growth Chamber, which enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, return a land you control to its owner's hand, and it taps to add both green and a blue. So not only does this help us with our combo, but also this gives us an extra land drop. It's not necessarily like ramp where it accelerates your mana right away, but we are playing Commander, which is a long game format, which means often we're going to miss a land drop. It happens all the time. And so this gives you 1 extra land drop. And in any situation where you're about to miss a land drop, this will net you an additional mana on the battlefield. Of course, if you're just drawing, untapped lands every turn and you're playing a land every turn, then this isn't as good. But in any situation where you're going to maybe miss a land drop, I would put these in the deck. They actually work really well. Same with Coral Atoll, which enters tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you sacrifice it unless you return an untapped island you control to its owner's hand, and it taps for both a colorless and a blue mana. So this just also helps us go infinite with the Freed from the Real combo, and like I just said, this also helps us get an extra land drop, right? It helps us in any situation where we might miss a land drop. It gets us that land drop. Next, we have Terramorphic Expanse, which is a land that taps and sacrifices itself to let you search your library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. So again, filling our graveyard is why this land is in the deck. Next is Blast Zone, which enters the battlefield with a charge counter on it. You can tap it for a colorless, or you can pay XX and tap it to put X charge counters on it, and you can pay 3 and tap it and sacrifice it to destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on Blast Zone. So it has to be the exact same mana cost as the number of charge counters that were on Blast Zone. So it's just a great removal card, right? It helps us kill creatures which blue and green don't do very well, right? It helps bounce them to their owner's hand. It can transform them into frogs and things like that, but as far as killing them, it has a tough time, so Blast Zone is great in this deck. Next, we have Gyre Reach Sanitarium, a land that taps to add a colorless, or you can pay 2 and tap it, and each player draws a card and then discards a card. So, helps draw us cards and helps fill our graveyard again. Next, we have Alchemist Refuge, which is a land that taps to add a colorless, or we can pay a green and a blue and tap it, and you may cast non-land cards this turn as though they had flash. So casting cards as though they had flash is really great because it helps protect your creatures, right? Normally you cast your creature and you have to wait the entire turn cycle through everyone else's turn before you can even use that creature, right? Because it's summoning sick. Well, with this, you can wait till the end step of the turn before your upkeep to cast your creatures and make sure that they can actually end up attacking, right? And can actually end up activating their abilities and whatnot. So, pretty great card to have just in any green-blue deck. Casting cards at instant speed is a great way to keep in control of the game. Next, we have High Market, a land that taps to add a colorless mana to your mana pool, or you can tap it to sacrifice a creature and gain 1 life. Just another sacrifice outlet on a land, also helps us gain a little bit of life. Next, we have Emergent Zone, which taps to add a colorless, or we can pay 1 and sacrifice Emergent Zone, and you may cast spells this turn as though they had flash. So same as with Alchemist Refuge, it helps us cast spells at flash speed, also sacrifices itself to help us fill up the graveyard. Next, we have Reliquary Tower, which says you have no maximum hand size, and it taps to add a colorless. Next is Haunted Fengraf, which taps to add a colorless, or you can pay 3 and tap and sacrifice it to return a creature card at random from your graveyard to your hand. So it gets us a creature from our graveyard back to our hand and helps us fill up the graveyard. Next we have Waterlogged Grove, which you can tap and pay 1 life to add a green or blue mana to your mana pool, or you can pay 1 and tap it and sacrifice it to draw a card. Next we have Misty Rainforest, a land that says you can tap and pay 1 life and sacrifice it to search your library for a forest or island card and put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Misty Rainforest and Waterlogged Grove and Evolving Wilds are all 3 lands that can also sacrifice themselves. So Evolving Wilds, same thing as Terramorphic Expanse, you sacrifice it to search for a basic land and put it on the battlefield tapped. Next we have Command Tower, which taps to add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity. Great in any commander deck, except for maybe a monocolored deck. Next we have Cephalid Coliseum, which taps to add a blue mana to our mana pool, and it deals 1 damage to us, but it also has a threshold ability. So if we have 7 or more cards in our graveyard, we can pay a blue and tap it and sacrifice it, and have target player draw 3 cards and then discard 3 cards from his or her hand. So it's a pretty cool little card. It can, just act like a land and add mana to our mana pool, or it can draw us 3 cards and put 3 more cards into our graveyard, and then also put itself into our graveyard. So it's really putting 4 cards in our graveyard. Next we have Lotus Veil. When Lotus Veil comes into play, sacrifice 2 untapped lands or bury Lotus Veil, and it taps to add 3 mana of any 1 color to your mana pool. So this also goes infinite with Ley Weaver, and Into the Reel also helps us fill our graveyard with lands. Same thing with Lotus Field, but Lotus Field also has hexproof, and it enters the battlefield tapped. But same thing. When it enters the battlefield, you sacrifice 2 lands, and you can tap it to add 3 mana of any 1 color. So it goes infinite with Ley Weaver and Freed from the Reel, and helps us fill up our graveyard. And finally, we have 8 forests and 8 islands, and that's it. That's Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. My new favorite Simic commander. I love it. So let me know what you think. Let me know what you're doing with your Uro deck. Well, this is Eric from Bane Alley Magic signing off. Until next time, take care, take it easy.